Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 22 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the New Jersey Devils, in which the Sharks have won 5-2, so they split the season series here against the New Jersey Devils, getting some revenge for the shootout loss sustained a few weeks ago, and the Sharks now move to 2-0 on their road trip, open up yet another 2-game winning streak, and have now won 4 of their last 5 games. So you could say that the Sharks have actually gotten a bit of a rhythm going as of late, kind of a nice thing to see. Now, this game didn't necessarily start off all that well for the San Jose Sharks. You see, in the first period, while the Sharks did actually score the first and only goal in that opening 20 minutes, that one coming from Noah Gregor, it was actually the Devils, I felt, who were the somewhat better team in that opening frame. I don't think it was necessarily some sort of crazy New Jersey Devils domination and the Sharks were extremely lucky to even get a goal in that first period. I do think the Sharks were at least somewhat competitive, but if you asked the question of which team looked better in the first 20 minutes, I would have said the New Jersey Devils did. However, in the second period, the game did an absolute, complete 180 as the Sharks played not only, the best period of this game, but probably one of their best periods of this entire season in this second period, where they managed to score 3 goals, and this wasn't just 3 goals that they get lucky bounces on and the Devils were competitive. No, this was 3 goals in which, in a period, the Sharks just completely dominated. The Devils looked on the back foot for almost the entire 20 minutes, and even having said that, while the Sharks scored 3 goals, they probably could have had 5, maybe even 6, if not for 2 or 3 heroic saves from Mackenzie Blackwood, the Devils goaltender in this one of them being on Matt Nieto, I believe, who actually had a very nice move, but then ends up getting stonewalled. Another, I believe, on Logan Couture, if I'm not mistaken. So the Sharks could have opened up an even larger lead than this, but still 3 goals in the middle frame, very impressive. The first coming from Jacob Middleton, his first career goal on a manned net, though his second in general, as he scored an empty netter a few games ago. The Sharks actually get a power play goal in this one, that one coming from Timo Meier, his 10th of the season as he stays hot. And then the last goal of that second period was just really showing off the struggles of the Devils in that middle period, in which it was Erik Karlsson scoring on a nice pass from Barabanov. But even though this was, as I said, a nice pass, when you're passing it through 5 New Jersey Devils players, at a point it kind of transfers from, wow, what a great pass, to, I feel like one of the Devils players should have been able to have that. So again, credit goes to Barabanov for the pass, but it was also a pretty big struggle in general for New Jersey. As we then moved on into the third period, the Sharks with a 4-goal lead, and as we saw in the previous game against the Blackhawks, even with a single goal lead, they ended up turtling pretty hard. So here tonight, we were expecting pretty much the same thing, and the Sharks are doing a relatively decent job of that early on in this third period, but they end up getting caught a bit. Very nice play, very well read by Tomas Tatar, and he manages to get a goal to get a bit of momentum back into the New Jersey side and made it 4-1. Just a few minutes later, it was a bit of a fumble with the puck at the offensive zone blue line by Middleton, and as such, Jesper Bratt was able to score to make it 4-2. Luckily, after that, the Sharks did manage to lock it down. The Devils would end up pulling the goalie with about 3.5 minutes left, and a few moments later, it would be Timo Meier, his second of the game, and his second straight empty net goal to make it 5-2, and that would be the final score. Moving on to the lineup here, we take a look at the first line of Meier, Couture, and Dahlin. Obviously, credit has to go to Timo Meier. I don't think he was necessarily insanely dominant throughout this game, but he's just been a very consistent, very strong, and a very good shooter for the San Jose Sharks thus far this season. He continues to just stay on a rampage at this point in terms of points, at the very least. 22 points now in the 17 games he's played, so pretty well over a point per game at this point. His line buddy Logan Couture also looking pretty good in this one, had a very nice pass on that power play goal to Timo Meier. Also, as I said, ended up getting robbed in the second period by Blackwood, so he probably could have had a goal there. And so generally, it was a nice game from this duo. On the other hand, the odd man out on this first line was Jonathan Dahlin. Now, I gave him, a bit of slack for his Invisible Man costume in the previous game against the Chicago Blackhawks, because it was his first game back from injury. But here tonight, you're expecting him to be a bit more settled in, and I didn't really see much of Jonathan Dahlin in this particular game, which is a bit disappointing to see because of how effective this first line was early on in the season prior to all the COVID issues that the Sharks had. And so it would definitely be nice to see those three players actually find their chemistry and start working really well together, because right now it's kind of the Timo Meier and Logan Couture show, and Jonathan Dahlen's kind of just riding the coattails, which was something that I had specifically mentioned wasn't happening earlier on in the season, but now it kind of is. With the second line, this one did not start off particularly well in the first period. This line did not look all that great, and here I was thinking, oh, this is going to be another game where the Sharks' second line just doesn't show up. Barabanov continuing to look suspect defensively, Hertl just not doing much of anything, Balcers looking out of place in the top six, yada, yada, yada. But then the second period came along, and things just, again, completely turned around. It's not a coincidence that the second line for the Sharks found its game at the same time as the Sharks themselves found their game in this one. As Barabanov looked like a completely different player through the last 40 minutes of this one, was just finding offensive opportunity after offensive opportunity. You know, if you're going to be a somewhat suspect in the defensive zone, you got to bring an, elevated offensive aspect to your game to be able to play in that top six. And he did so with absolute certainty here tonight. He had a very nice pass on the Jacob Middleton goal. He had a very nice pass on the Erik Karlsson goal, and actually set up probably 3 or 4 other grade A opportunities for his line mate Tomas Hertl, who also looked quite effective in this game. And what's interesting is that the few and far between games where the second line of Hertl, Balcers, and Barabanov have looked really good, it's kind of been moments where just Hertl kind of takes over a game. But that wasn't necessarily the case here tonight. Not to say Hertl was bad. He had a very good game. It just was, a lot of it was also Barabanov playing well. So hopefully this is the start of something. I've said that before this season and it didn't end up being so I'm not going to hold out a ton of hope, but still very good game for the second line. On the third line, Cogliano ended up, I believe, getting sent home to San Jose for some personal issues. So a new third line was put together here as Bonino and Gregor were joined by Matt Nieto. But the real star of this line ended up being Noah Gregor. During the first period, where I said that the Sharks were, not playing well, outplayed by the New Jersey Devils, the only goal they scored was from Noah Gregor. And what I'm about to say is not just because he managed to score a goal in that first period, but also just generally his play in that first 20 minutes. Noah Gregor was by far the Sharks' best player in the opening frame of this game. He just looked so much more engaged than he has been in the past couple of games. He looked very, very similar to how he did in his first game of the season back against the Carolina Hurricanes. And hopefully that's something that can continue, because I've been talking about the past few games that the Sharks really need some offensive contributions from their bottom six. And so to see Noah Gregor on this third line and really bringing it, because he could have probably had at least one extra goal in this game if Blackwood wasn't really on point with his saves. It's nice to see a third liner actually showing up for the San Jose Sharks, because as we move the conversation to the fourth line, this is one that I'm not really going to talk about for too long, because this is a happy video. This is a nice video because the Sharks got the victory, but it's not really a happy topic with this fourth line. I thought they had a couple of okay shifts maybe early in the first period, but besides that, they never really got anything rolling. There's absolutely zero chemistry, which I guess isn't that much of a surprise between these three players of Peterson, Gadjovich, and Kevin Labanc. Just kind of looked not particularly good at all for any of these players. So it wasn't a huge issue because the second line really showed up for the Sharks, and Noah Gregor looked quite solid on the third line. But hopefully they can find a fourth line with a bit more consistency. Obviously, once Cogliano does return from that personal issue, when the Sharks probably return home, that would probably be the moment that does occur. We can get a bit more of a consistent fourth line, because this one definitely did not work. Onto the defensive side of things, the first pairing we have Ferraro and Burns, and the Sharks had a bit of a scare when it came to Brent Burns in this game. Near the end of the first period, he would end up going to the dressing room, and then when the start of the second period came along, he didn't actually come back to the bench immediately. And it really made me think, Brent Burns has been such a workhorse for the San Jose Sharks, and I've mentioned that many times before, but that was more so in the context of, he plays 25, 26 minutes a night, sometimes even more than that, and he plays in the power play situation, the penalty kill situation, and 5-on-5, of course. But it should also be noted that Brent Burns has played every single San Jose Sharks game for the past, 7 years, from the 14-15 season onward. So 14-15, 15-16, 16-17, 17-18, 18-19, 19-20, 20-21, and now so far in 21-22, so 7 years and now a bit. Brent Burns has played every single game. That type of longevity from any player is extremely admirable. But the fact that this is coming from a player who plays a tough role, who plays in every situation, who can get close to 30 minutes on a lot of nights is insanely impressive. I mean, you take a look at the Ironman streak of, let's say, Patrick Marleau. That was obviously an extremely impressive streak that he accrued with a combination of the San Jose Sharks and the Toronto Maple Leafs. But, Marleau was mostly a winger. He plays more on the edges. He doesn't take a lot of hits. He doesn't play a ton of minutes, especially near the end of his career, getting, 13, 14 minutes. And yet his Ironman streak, as I said, was still rather impressive. Brent Burns getting this many games consecutively and then playing all these big minutes is incredibly impressive. So yes, say what you want about Brent Burns, how his performance can sometimes, shift upwards, downwards, and be kind of bad, then sometimes kind of good, sometimes fantastic, sometimes just insanely poor. But Brent Burns has been, the heart and soul of the San Jose Sharks for a while now. Onto the second pairing, we of course have Jacob Middleton, who I must once again mention. I've mentioned this many times with Middleton in the past thus far this season, but it's just so crazy to continue to imagine how Jacob Middleton, just as recently as last season, couldn't even put together an 8-minute performance throughout an entire 60-minute game in which he looked even serviceable, right? Even when he played 7 minutes, 8 minutes in a game as a sixth defenseman where the Sharks just needed a warm body, he did horribly in that particular role. And now suddenly he's a actually solid top 4 defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. There's the transition between that, what we saw in the previous few years, and this year has been insane for Jacob Middleton, and he's rewarded with a goal here tonight. But obviously the most interesting player on this pairing was Erik Karlsson, who seemed to be rolling with a lot of confidence in tonight's game against the New Jersey Devils. There were a couple of misplays early on here in the first period when the Sharks were struggling, but from that point onwards, Erik Karlsson was making slick defensive zone plays, very nice offensive zone plays. He also was rewarded with a goal in tonight's game. And so, you take a look at some of the advanced stats, and a lot of them are showing that Erik Karlsson has really rebounded this season and has looked, elite and back like his Ottawa Senators days. The eye test doesn't go so much in that direction, but with more games like these, maybe the eye test will start to support those more deeper advanced stats. And then finally, the last pairing for the Sharks, Simek and Vlasic. I don't think they were completely awful, but compared to the other two pairings, not necessarily a great game. Vlasic had a couple of nice stick plays in this one to break up some opportunities for the Devils, but then there were also some misplays. In particular, he just doesn't really have his head on a swivel to prevent this Tomas Tatar goal that started making the San Jose Sharks sweat a bit in that third period, so that was slightly disappointing to see. I don't think it was awful, like I said, but also not necessarily a game to write home about. And finally, the goaltending situation for the Sharks. James Reimer with yet another start. We're clearly moving past the territory of, who's going to get the next start? Is it Adin Hill? Is it James Reimer? Who's the real starter here? And we're pretty firmly in the territory of James Reimer is the starter for the San Jose Sharks. At the very least, currently, Adin Hill is strictly the backup at this point. Reimer has just been superb, kept up a shutout streak for 5 periods on this road trip, with the shutout against the Chicago Blackhawks and the shutout through the first 2 periods against the Devils. Yes, this second goal by Jesper Bratt, I was not particularly impressed by James Reimer's read of this one. It seemed as though he kind of thought this was going to be a much lower shot than it did. I'm not entirely sure if this deflected. I didn't think it did, but again, it's kind of a situation where Reimer, it looked like he read this puck so poorly that you kind of are forced to believe that the puck did deflect. I haven't watched the replay closely enough to know, but even so, ignoring that goal, he only lets in 2 in this one. Another solid performance, was really good in that first period to keep the Sharks' hopes alive and allowed them to really come alive in the second period. And while it's possible Adin Hill does get the start, because eventually he does have to start another game when we come up to the game on Thursday, it honestly wouldn't even still surprise me that much if it is James Reimer getting another look there. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. They will take on the New York Islanders, who haven't had much action as of late because they've been on the COVID protocol situation. And unlike the San Jose Sharks, when they were sitting with 7 players out and then had to call up a bunch of players from the Barracuda to fill in those roster spots and played 5 or 6 games with that type of roster. The Islanders actually got a few of their games postponed. They are going to be returning to action on November 30th on Thursday against the Sharks, and we'll see if they're going to be rusty or well rested. Class dismissed.